And now I'm going to hand over to my lovely guest host for this week's episode, Cathal Quinlan. Cathal, you are very welcome. Thank you for being my host and my question answer. And I'm not nervous at all.
I
Thank you
know
so
if
much.
you're not a bit, I can tell you're not a bit nervous. You're like,
Stop.
oh my God, I'm handing over the power. I'm so delighted to be here, Aoife. Thank you so much for inviting me along. I love your podcast, of course, Happier at Work. Absolutely. A big fan. So I am delighted you've asked me to do this. So thank you so much. Aoife asked me to do a quick intro to myself. I'm Cathal Quinlan. I have been working for 20 years in corporate jobs, started my career at Goldman Sachs in London, stayed there for about 10 years in a variety of different jobs, loved it there, and then came to Australia about 9 years ago, worked for a large retail bank here called Westpac, did a lot of work in transformation, employee engagement, innovation, and now I'm doing my own thing and do go into companies and help with problems they've got. And I'm just about to launch a podcast as well. So I'm very excited to be here. So Aoife, this episode's all about you.
I'm in the hot seat today, Cathal.
You're in the hot seat. And I know lots of people are going to be very interested. I've got a few questions here. And don't worry, there's no clangers here. You're going to get, it's going to be a nice, gentle ride through our questions this afternoon. Today. Okay, so Aoife,
this morning my time, I might add that Cathal is actually in Sydney. So early morning my time, afternoon, evening Cathal's time.
Yes, and for anyone in Ireland that thinks Sydney has beautiful weather, we have had rain. It's pitch dark here and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So don't be jealous of Australia today. I can tell you it is certainly not a beautiful day in
It's
Australia.
reminding you of home, Cathal.
It's definitely reminding me of home. I've even got an old cup of tea here, so I'm all set to go. Well, Aoife, why don't we start with, I gave a little bit of my background, but let's hear about your background. How did it all begin for you from a work-wise perspective?
Interesting. I in college, actually, let's jump back to college. In college, I studied international business with Spanish and German. I had done German in school for my Leaving Cert, and I took up Spanish, as they called it then, an ab initio language. So I learned it from scratch, basically, for 4 years. And I spent a year of that on Erasmus over in Barcelona, which I absolutely adored. And I somehow missed a lot of the, as they call them here, the milk rounds, when you're kind of go for these graduate roles. And I somehow missed a few of those. I think I wasn't really paying attention to what was going on.
You were too busy in Barcelona.
I was too busy. Well, I was home by that stage now. But in terms of how I got started, kind of doing, or how my career has evolved, I think the first kind of, let's say, proper job I had was in category development. And that was on the road, essentially using category data to sell extra product. And at that time, I was working for an alcohol company. So we're selling more beer into various supermarkets, independent off licenses, but using data. And that sort of evolved into, I got to a stage where I was like, why is no one going to London? And I feel like maybe I was waiting for someone to grab me by the hand and say, come on, Aoife, let's go over to London. Because I think one of the things I didn't realise, but not everyone has the same kind of ambitions or desires in life. And for me, that was something I always wanted to do. London compared to Dublin seemed like the big smoke, and always wanted to live there at one point. So I think I was 26 or 20, maybe 27, going over to London. And when I told my friends, they're like, oh, wow, you've been talking about that for years. It's about time you did that. So I went to London and I got a job with a company at that time called TNS World Panel. They're now called, they changed to Kantar World Panel, but now I think they're World Panel by Kantar, which sounds a lot fancier, a lot sexier. Wow. But I intended to stay in London for about a year and then earn a bit of sterling and head on over to Australia. And what I ended up doing was staying in London for 3.5 years. I loved my job. I loved London. I just had a brilliant time. But time was kind of running out.
Where did
Sorry?
you live in London?
Where did I live?
Yeah.
I lived in Ealing with my aunt for the first 9 months, and then I lived in Shepherd's Bush, or Shebu, as the cool kids call it. Um, so close enough to White City, and I worked out west. So I was taking the tube every day, but I was going against the traffic. And I have to say, I loved taking the tube. I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, the tube, it's so horrible, it's awful." I absolutely loved it. I loved taking the tube every day. It was one of my highlights of London, just the excitement of it and being on the tube. It all sounds a bit funny now, but
People watching.
yeah, people watching, picking up the Metro, the free newspaper that they have on the tube, catching up on the celebrity gossip and the various different things the free events that were going on, and things like that. Um, Now, I made the decision, and at the time, you had to apply for your Australian visa before you turned 30, and then you had a year to use it. So I headed on over to Australia. I think I arrived when I was about 31, after travel all around Southeast Asia for about 6 months. And I got into Perth thinking, oh, I'm going to keep on traveling, but actually it was such a relief to have somewhere to hang up my clothes, to have a real towel rather than a travel towel after 6 months of using that. And so I decided to stay in Perth, and I got a job as a recruitment coordinator. And this is something I'd never done before. It was very scary, but I must say again, I absolutely loved my job. I loved the company. It was just brilliant. It was really like a family atmosphere. The role was very kind of process driven, but you're dealing with people all the time as well. So it was something that I really felt like I was playing to my strengths. I could go in there and be like, right, okay, so how can we make this more efficient, or how can we do this a little bit better? So I absolutely loved it.
Are you naturally just a happy kind of person anyway? So when you go into these jobs, these first few jobs you've just talked about, it seems you've loved them. You've loved the experience. It's so infectious to hear this.
It's so funny you say that, because maybe I took that for granted, Cathal. Maybe I just assumed that this is what work is like and I'm going to love every job I have. But then, let's say the tables turned slightly with another role that I had, where I got in there, and this was in Sydney, and I loved the people that I worked with, and I loved the role that I was doing, but I definitely felt overloaded with the amount of work that I had. And the leaders were making all sorts of promises to me, like, oh, you're going to be a director. What kind of director do you want to be? And then one of my peers was promoted to be my manager. And the entire situation was just like, I think within a couple of months, I felt like I was up to speed with everything that was going on. There were other people coming to me, asking me questions, but they'd been at the organisation for longer. So it was a really kind of strange situation to be in. On the one hand, I felt like I was being recognised by my peers as the go-to person, but on the other hand, not being recognised by leaders, and having, someone who had never managed anyone before to be my manager when I'd been promised to be one of the directors. So it was just a very strange situation, and I felt like I was being micromanaged as well. So after they had sponsored me, they paid me a high salary. I left within less than 18 months, actually, of joining that organisation. And, for me, it kind of tainted a lot of Sydney. Like we were chatting before we started recording. I left Sydney, it will be 10 years ago this year, and I haven't been back since. And, that wasn't my intention. I had intended to go back to visit at some point. But I sort of see that as the start of planting the seed of what it is that I do now. So what I want, I was questioning a lot of things that really knocked my own confidence until very recently, I have to say. I think it impacted on my own confidence and my self-esteem in the work that I do. And in terms of the seed for what it is that I do now, I was asking questions like, well, what could I have done differently to manage my career better? What could I have done differently to avoid going into that situation? But equally, as an organisation, what could they have done differently to manage me better, to support me better, to not lose me, having sponsored my visa, having paid me a high salary, having me leave with all of that knowledge that I gained quite quickly within the organisation, and for me to just leave in less than 18 months, that obviously cost them a lot of money. So I suppose I was looking at it from both perspectives, and that was the kind of seed planted. Now that, it's kind of been germinating over time, over the last 10 years or so, to where I am now. But I travelled some more then. So I left Australia. I travelled around Australia after I left that job. I travelled around the States. So I flew to visit friends I went to Fiji first, and then I visited friends in New Zealand. And then I went to Hawaii, and I met up with some family in Hawaii. Sorry, excuse me. So I met up with some family in Hawaii, including my parents. My parents came over to visit Hawaii as well.
Wow.
And then I flew to San Francisco from Hawaii, stayed with family there, and I rented a car and I drove down Highway 1, which was incredible. Although I needed definitely longer than the 2 days I gave myself. It's just incredible scenery there, absolutely. And the perfect time of year to go. I went around October time. I think in summertime it tends to be quite foggy, but October was just absolutely stunning, beautiful weather. So I travelled a little bit more around the States. This was around the time that Obama was coming into power for the second time against Mitt Romney. He was travelled around Canada as well. Ended up in New York for Thanksgiving. So I was there and then went up to Christmas as well. So I travelled a little bit around the East Coast. And then I came home to Ireland for Christmas. But would you believe the return flight from New York to Dublin was actually cheaper than the one-way flight? So I decided to book a return flight, came back to New York after Christmas, I went down to visit a friend in Miami, and then spent 5 months travelling around South America, including a trip to Antarctica and the Galapagos Islands. So that was absolutely...
Thank God for that job in Sydney. It must have paid well, because you were traveling.
I tell you,
the Chalmers.
I tell you, Cathal,
you were here. You were all over the place.
I tell you, Cathal, the people thought that I had won the lottery because I was traveling so much. But now I'll have to say, like, it's not as if I was staying in hotels. I was staying in hostels. I was living out of a backpack. I was doing it on the cheap. They're not expensive countries to travel in either. No. So. But I did. I said, I'm a saver. I tend to save my money, and then I spend it on things that I think are really, really important.
It was probably timely post, for anyone that has had a tough job or a micromanager. I've certainly experienced that myself, and for the listeners, Aoife and I have chatted about that, and it is a very stressful time, and you almost have to wash it out of your system once you've worked for someone like that.
Absolutely.
And I actually think fair play to you that you went off and you went and did this and just had some time. And how nice that you had those memories with your family and everything. You got to meet your family. I think it's great.
No, it really was incredible. So I ended up back in Dublin then, and that's coming on 9 years now. And it's hard to believe, because at the time I was thinking, as I was traveling through South America, will I go back to London, where I had come from prior to moving to Australia? Will I go back to Dublin, where I'm from? Or will I go to New York, which is something I've always wanted to do. And we've talked about this as well, and I'm so jealous of your time in New York. But I wanted, it's still something I want to do. And actually, having done a master's recently, I was entitled to apply for a visa to work in the States, which I would have loved to have done. But with COVID and everything, there's just the timing. They had stopped doing the visas. The timing didn't really work out very well. So if anyone is listening in New York and would like to, invite me over, I'm going to say give me a job. But I have a job running my own business. But it really is something I have always wanted to do, and I'll find a way to do it at some point. So I ended up back in Dublin, and it's only upon reflection now and what I'm learning now, but I was out of work. I had stopped working in June of the prior year, and I started working again in October. So, that's a year and 4 months, essentially. It's longer than the average maternity leave. And I was coming back into the workplace, And like I say, I hadn't really given it consideration, but I really needed a transition period. I needed someone to support me through that. And I didn't really feel that, but I wasn't aware that I needed it either. I was just trying to get back into the swing of things, trying to get back into routine, trying to bring all of this global experience that I had and apply it into this global organization, but in Dublin. And, you know, anyone who works in Ireland in sort of a, in a multinational company, I feel like the Irish branches, or whatever you want to call it, the Irish subsidiaries always tend to be the forgotten ones, or that's, it's part of the UK or something. They're a little bit smaller, a little bit more insular. But the same sort of thing, not exactly the same thing happened, but I felt like I loved my job and then I didn't love it so much anymore. And then I loved it again and then I didn't love it so much anymore. And, you know, I think eventually by the time I got to the stage where I decided to leave, there was a few things going on for me, but I think the main driver of it was that I wasn't working to my strengths. And I have kind of touched on this on the podcast before, where
This was in Dublin, was it?
This was in Dublin, yeah.
And what was the job you were doing in Dublin?
I got promoted a couple of times actually in that role. So I worked in that role for 4.5 years. I'm like, am I allowed to say the name of the company? I'm not sure. I'm sure some people listening know the name.
Even if you tell us what kind of work you were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you know what? When I started there, I was doing work that was similar enough to what I had been doing in London and in Sydney. And that was account management do you know what? I never even talked about that, did I? So I was doing account management for market research firms. So analysing data, managing clients, business development, delivering presentations, like all of that really great stuff. And I loved it. And, you know, I started doing that when I was in London. I continued doing that when I was in Australia. And then coming back to Ireland, I think the data maybe wasn't as interesting as when I had worked in London and also in Australia. But, you know, similar enough role. And then I was promoted to be a manager. And then I was again, you know, offered this position, and this is kind of where I see things started to fall apart slightly, where I had the option to continue doing something and working to my strengths in analytics and the analytics team and very much focusing on that, or to be on the leadership team, but in an area I was less interested in and maybe less good at as well. And of course, you know, the ego is like, oh, the leadership team, of course you want to be on the leadership team. And so I took that opportunity, which probably wasn't necessarily working to my strengths. And I'm the kind of person, I want to do a really good job. I want to do an excellent job. I'm highly ambitious. And if I'm not able to do that, or if I'm not supported to do that, if I'm not working to my strengths, then it really kind of hampers me. So that's sort of, I did that for, I think, about 1.5 or 2 years before I made the decision, like, this is not for me. And it kind of then got me thinking of, okay, so if this is not for me, do I want to stay in the organization? Because it's a global organization. I could have got a global role. My boss was really supportive of that. You know, he was saying, oh, well, you could, but it made me start questioning everything. And then this idea of happiness at work and all of that kind of stuff came up. However, what I will say is, when I left my role, I didn't have the intention of, I'm leaving now to go and set up my own business. I left without anything else to go to because I was quite miserable there. And over time, you know, I felt compelled, I felt kind of called. When I left my job, I went on to do a career coaching certificate, and I thought, over the course of a weekend, I'm going to be able to help everyone. I'm going to solve the world's problems and help people with their careers. But on that, I met people who had done a longer life and executive coaching diploma, so I could see the difference in their skills versus my skills. So I went on to do that diploma. As I was kind of finishing up that diploma, during the summer, I had some sort of, like, I can only describe it as an epiphany. At one point, I was deciding, you know, because I had never left a job with nothing else to go to, or no kind of excuse or no reason. When I left my job in London, I was moving to Australia. I was traveling and moving to Australia. When I left my job in Australia, it was to go home or to travel. But in Dublin, this was like, this is a new thing for me. You know, I left without anything. So in the run up to, you know, when I was not happy at work and I was doing all this research, I was looking at doing an MBA, but I was also looking at doing this master's in DCU in organizational behavior. And I had an epiphany then. You know, this is probably a couple of years later, going, wait a minute, wasn't I looking at that master's? What if I look at that again? So the process was so quick. I looked it up again. I paid the application. I went through the process. I got in. And, you know, the irony being, had I gone on to do that a couple of years prior, I would have graduated with that master's much earlier than what I did. But I'm so glad that I did that. So during the process of that master's, that's when I set up the business. That kind of reignited my passion for all things data and research and like people at work and understanding people's behavior and kind of putting people back at the focus of work. And so that's kind of how I've got to where I am in a very realised now, very roundabout journey, or very roundabout.
It's really good because, I mean, I think for your listeners, it's good for them to hear that, you know, people have squiggly type careers. I think there's a book out by someone, and I think it's called
the Squiggly Career. I've read it. Yeah, they have a podcast as well. And
I think that when you have shared your background there, it just shows that it's squiggly, right? I mean, and I think that that's good in a way, because you learn from the failures sometimes. And, you know, when I say failures, you know, that role in Australia sounded like it didn't work out. You didn't enjoy it. And it's sometimes you need those moments, because then it drives you on to the next thing. And then
it's funny, Carl, because I liked the people and I liked the role and I was damn good at it, even if I say so myself, you know. And I can see now when I look back, having done the research for my master's, understanding a little bit more about people and human behaviour at work and all of those things, it was my needs that were being frustrated. So we have this universal need for autonomy. And when you're being micromanaged, you have no autonomy. Like, my boss used to go in and have a look at my calendar and say, oh, well, it looks like you have nothing on. You've no work today. So here's a whole load of work. And I thought, that's not how I manage my workload. I write it down on a piece of paper and here's all of the work that I'm doing. And there were times that I was given work and I ended up staying in the office way later than anyone else, and I would just go into a room, you know, and have a little cry, to be perfectly honest, because I was feeling so frustrated, so micromanaged, and just I didn't really know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to. And I think that's probably a huge problem, generally speaking, in work, that if you're having a problem, who can you talk to? Is it your manager? Like, is your manager open to that? Or is it, if you have a problem with your manager, is their boss going to take their side? You know, there's all of these kind of issues.
I think it's a very interesting point, because you and I have chatted about that before as well. And interestingly enough, I had a lady on my podcast recently called Tessa West, and we talked about micromanagers, interestingly. And she's got a book, which I have, you can see all the Post-it notes in.
Jerks at Work.
I love it. And her book is called Jerks at Work. And she says there's 7 types of jerks at work. And one is the micromanager. The most dangerous is the gaslighter. But to your point about the micromanager, that's terrible that you felt like that. I mean, micromanagers, I mean, what I talked about with her is, with Tessa, micromanagers, I found when I worked for a micromanager, I don't know if this happened to you, but I almost became a micromanager. And because Tessa actually says it's the most contagious of all styles, because if you're being micromanaged and you've got a team then below you, you're like, oh God, you need this, you need that. But I think it's great.
So interesting.
You know, I'm coming back now to one of my next questions, because you kind of answered it there a little bit, but you know, you started the podcast and the business, and you touched on a little bit. So the purpose, what's your purpose statement for the business and the kind of podcast? It's like, what's, like, you know, what do you say when someone asks you the purpose of your business?
It's kind of what's my why. Well, I suppose there's a couple of ways to answer that, but before I go on to that, I wanted to touch on another point on this
Go for it.
the frustration piece in Australia. And I think more than anything, it might have been a values clash as well. Like the importance of values is so, so strong. But when you are made promises and those promises are not fulfilled, or those promises are not lived up to, like that's a huge area of frustration for me. And I'm noticing that even in my own business, when people say they'll do something and they don't, it causes a lot of frustration for me. Anyway, back to this idea of the purpose. So I suppose for me, sorry, I got a frog in my throat or something today.
Because the spotlight's on you today.
Yeah, I'm so nervous.
And for your listeners, she is nervous today. She's used to doing this for 100
I'm used to being on the other side.
She's used to being on the other side. She's like, I said to her, but I'm friendly, Aoife. I won't be bad. I'll be nice. Anyway.
So yeah, back to this idea of purpose. And I think, to be perfectly honest, when I started the podcast, I probably didn't have a clear purpose in mind. I knew I'm a huge podcast listener. I absolutely love podcasts. I think it's a fantastic way to digest information. I still continue to listen to loads and loads of different podcasts, and so I thought podcast is the obvious thing for me to do. And also I have this message that I want to get out there, that work doesn't have to suck, that work can be okay, and you can have happiness at work. And as I shared from my kind of earlier previous experiences, I was actually really happy at work in those organizations. So that's kind of from the podcast perspective. And I feel like the business has evolved over time. So on the one hand, when I started, it was like, I want to change the world through helping people with their careers. But with my corporate background, it was like, I'm selling myself short a little bit here, because I know that I can help companies as well. And I've, and with this, with the masters that I did as well, and the research and my background in data analytics and research, I can help companies to use their own information, or I don't know what's going on. So use their own information, or use publicly available research information that I carry out as well, to help them make better decisions. And I think, and we've talked about this before, Carl, and it's probably something I've never touched on the podcast before, but the ultimate goal for me is finding some sort of a matching solution between people and organizations, but based on, I think there's companies out there that do it based on skills, but when I did the research, skills are the least important factor when it comes to feeling whether or not you belong at work. And actually the most important from a hiring perspective are values, but then from a retention perspective is needs satisfaction. So if you want to keep people in a role, if you want to keep your top talent, you need to make sure that their needs are being satisfied. So that's the ultimate goal of where I want to get to, is some sort of a tech solution for matching people with organizations. So, and I suppose that springs from, if I had that situation in Sydney, if I had maybe some sort of a values profile of the organization itself, or the managers or the leaders in the organization, versus a values profile of me, it might have said, well, actually there's a mismatch here, and you're not going to feel fulfilled, you're not going to feel like you're thriving in this environment, because there's too much of a mismatch here. And then
I think it's fantastic, when you talk through your broader business, because obviously when you and I have chatted before, I've always been intrigued by that, because I think there's two sides to it, right? I mean, for the person, the individual, to know whether their values are aligned with a company is a big tick. But also I think for companies to know whether the person they're taking on is aligned to potentially their values.
Exactly.
I mean, my experiences in financial services, the banks got a terrible reputation over the years, and I obviously worked there. I'm proud of working at the banks, but sometimes some people maybe had the wrong values, and when they came and worked for the company, they had a real impact on the brand of those companies, because they had the wrong values. And now the banks in particular, ones I've worked in, they put a real focus on behaviors first. Organizations, it's like, we've got to have people with the right behaviors here, because ultimately they are our brand, and if we have the wrong people in, it can cause a huge issue. So I see huge benefit essentially from what you want to do, because it helps the individual and in some cases helps the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I mean, even going beyond that, like, is there a way to, for want of a better word, to avoid hiring assholes? I'm sure people who are listening today, and I'm sure, like, I certainly have worked with assholes. I'm sure you have too, Carl.
One or two.
And I'm reading a book at the moment all about that, and how to avoid hiring. I have to turn around now and have a look. It's called The No Asshole Rule.
Oh my God, this is so funny. I got a text this morning about that book from an ex-colleague. I used to manage her, Pooja. She sent me a message this morning going, you need to read Daniel Pink. He's just come out with a new book called The No Asshole Rule. And she said it's amazing.
No, the one I'm reading is Robert Sutton, and it's an older book. But Daniel Pink, he wrote Drive.
Yeah, so he's got a new book out, and it launched today, called The No Asshole Rule. And that's what she told me anyway. She said it launched today. Daniel Pink. Anyway.
I must check that out.
I agree. You don't want to. Well, the story really is, as you said, companies don't want to have assholes in there. They actually ends up costing a lot of money for companies if they have bullying cases or,
exactly.
To me, if you hire a bad leader, it has a huge ramifications. Particularly the leadership level, because they can impact so many people.
Yeah. And I see a huge shift in how leaders are approaching things. I see more authenticity and vulnerability shining through in the companies that are really leading the way in this space, if you like. And I think, another kind of facet of that, and something that we talked about, I was going to say a lot, maybe not a lot, but we talked about a little bit during the Masters, was this idea of psychopaths. And there's a lot of psychopaths actually that can kind of work their way to the top of organizations. And I think there's the CEOs over index on the psychopath test and things like that. So I was going to say maybe avoid hiring psychopaths, but maybe sometimes in small doses, or if they're being managed correctly, if they're not surrounded by other psychopaths, then it's okay. But just knowing that profile within your organization of what the values of the people are. But also, I don't want to dismiss strengths either. I think strengths are really important. Skills, maybe not so much. And this idea of experience, and I have 10 years of experience of doing this, let's call that out. That's total bullshit, because you might have 10 years of, and I've talked about this before in the podcast, 10 years of cushy experience where you haven't had any issues whatsoever. You haven't learned anything. You can't necessarily apply what you've done. You can't take things from one context to another context. There's so many different facets to that, I think. Yeah.
Well, you often hear the phrase, like, you hire for attitude. Like, it's skills you can
train for skill.
People.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
Skills.
Yeah.
But the attitudes, I have hired a lot of people over my career, and sometimes I've gotten it wrong. I put my hand up. I've gotten it wrong. And you've got to be careful. Sometimes you hire people like yourself, and that's not always good.
Yeah.
You need to bring different people in. But to your point about I've always personally hired people for attitude, energy. I think, you can, I get a good sense of someone. I go, okay, this is a good energy. Their attitude is good. And even sometimes, you mentioned your trip, and when you were talking about your background, I actually like people that share with me, okay, well, I had a bad experience here. I went off and I did this. I go, great. Tell me more about that, because actually you want
it's a piece of kind of self-reflection or something.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think going back to your point as well, like this idea of hiring for attitude, but and not hiring people necessarily like yourself, that's where the values piece comes in, I think. And knowing in advance, like, rather than having to invest all of that time in interviewing, knowing in advance that this person is likely a good match for our organization. But also, like, sometimes when the perception is that if people's values are all aligned, that there's no diverse thinking, and that's also causes stagnation in organizations. So testing for diversity of thought, like do people think differently, and they might think differently if they're from a different industry, for example. They might have similar values, but they're from a different industry, there's all of these great things. So that's, talking about the where the business is now and where I want to get to. Like, I offer at the moment a range of programs. I offer speaking. I do quite a lot of speaking, actually, training and workshops. I've recently launched my Imposter to Empowered program into corporates. And I am in the process of launching the Happier at Work program, which will eventually become this tech solution. So this matching of values, looking at needs, looking at leadership, looking at personality profiles at work, all of the things that are really important for retention in this day and age of the Great Resignation.
I love it. I wish you were, well, I wish if I was still in my old company, I'd be getting you in to do a pilot with us on the value piece. So I hope whoever you're doing it with in Ireland, or if you're looking for people to do pilots, I'm sure
I'm still looking,
looking for people to do pilots with you?
Absolutely.
Or no?
Yeah, looking for, and I posted on LinkedIn recently, and there's still some room for people to do pilots with me if they want to. Yeah,
pilots
absolutely.
are so good. I mean, Aoife and I'm a big fan of pilots. It's such a good way to test something for you as well, Aoife, and obviously for an organization, because they can co-create it with
exactly.
you.
Yeah. They're the co-creators of this, and it's getting that feedback. They get the benefit of a better understanding of what's going on and what they can do and how they can retain their staff, essentially.
Exactly. And it's so critical. But we're going to shift gears slightly now.
Great.
Tell me when you are happiest at work. Like, when are you in the zone, or what's that phrase they say, you're in flow, you've got your flow going? When is that?
Do you know what? There's a few things. I'm a total and utter data geek.
I know.
So when I was doing my research for my dissertation, like, I totally got lost in all of that. And I mean that in a good way. Like, I wasn't lost in the data, but I lost time because I was and I was trying to figure things out and trying to slice things in slightly different ways to see if it gave me different answers. Like, that really lights me up. I really like that. And
this is where Aoife and I are very different.
Yeah.
Aoife and I were chatting a few weeks back. I was like, Jesus, I mean, I love having people in the team who are good at the data, but I'm not the data person. She is the data queen. And you know what? It's such a great skill, Aoife. You should be delighted that that's what gives you flow.
Yeah. No, I absolutely, love that. But like, I suppose there's other aspects to the happiness at work. And, I have to practice what I preach. It's living my core values. So making sure that my values align with the people that I interact with the people that I work with, making sure I'm clear on my values and that I'm living those values as well. The need satisfaction piece. So that's understanding what my needs are and ensuring that my needs are being satisfied. Working to my strengths. So, I talked about the data piece, but I think relationships with people at work as well are really, really important. And finding people who you get on with, finding people that you click with, that's one of the loneliest things I find at the moment, is that, I can't just lift my head and look around in an office and ask someone a question, or just connect with someone, or take a stroll outside for a coffee or something like that. Just being surrounded by people, I think, is something I really miss at the moment.
But there's a lot of studies on that as well, isn't there? I mean, I was talking to someone on my podcast as well, Bruce Daisley, the other day, and Bruce was the ex-CEO of Twitter.
Yes.
I think he was saying that actually having a friend at work is one of the key things to help with happiness at work. That's
what Gallup talk about, in their engagement surveys, having a best friend at work. Yeah.
It makes such a difference. So, okay, it sounds, in summary, you're happiest when you are flying through data like crazy. I just have an image of you with just formulas and everything going crazy.
Just trying to solve, I think trying to solve problems really is how you could probably summarize it. So whatever that might be, and I have talked about this briefly before on the podcast, but being able to identify what a problem is and then provide a solution to that problem, I think that's where I got really lit up.
So that's when the old you're at your best. Well,
yes.
Now, the other thing I want to ask you was hobbies outside of work and
going
down. Like, you know, what are some of your hobbies outside of work? Because I'm sure the listeners would love to know that.
And you know what? Like, it seems when people ask me that, it's kind of hard to think, because in the last 2 years it feels like, you know, have we had time or have we had opportunity for our hobbies? I mean, there's loads of stuff I suppose I'm interested in. I'm in a camera club, so a photography club here in Dublin, near where I live. I love taking photographs. I don't want to tell you, or maybe I'm afraid to tell you, how many photos I have on my phone. It's like 40,000 or something. When I went traveling, I had my big camera, so my DSLR. I had my phone, I had a kind of point and shoot little camera, but I also had an underwater camera, which was capable, you know, that was doing my panoramics and all of this kind of stuff. So I love photography. I love baking. I love going to the cinema and like watching classic movies and old movies. I do running to keep fit. I do a bit of yoga, Pilates, swimming. Now, I say all of this, I don't do it all at once, and it's, you know, it's fallen by the wayside slightly. I think it was easier to do running and stuff during the pandemic.
And I also saw
what else. Yes.
When you were away on you were off for a week last week, and
yes,
I loved your email response. You're out of office. You were like, you were practicing what you preach, and you are not on email. So it sounds like you are an advocate for giving yourself a digital detox every now and again.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's, I think, the first time I had properly done that. So anytime I had taken a holiday prior to that, I had my laptop with me. I could access emails in some way. Even if there wasn't Wi-Fi, I could do a hotspot on my phone or something. So the reality is, in the last 3 years, that's the first time I've taken probably a proper break. And speaking of digital detox, I did take off all of the apps off my phone. So I took off Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter. They're the kind of time sucks for me, if you like. The Instagram especially, I think if I go down that rabbit hole and I'm looking at what other people are up to and looking through stories and you know, like I enjoy it as a platform, but it takes up a lot of my time. So when I took them all off my phone, I am reluctant to put them back on. So I'm home now nearly a week and I'm reluctant to put them back on my phone.
Wow. Well done you, my God. I mean, we all go down those bloody rabbit holes. It's hard to get back out of them. And I think sometimes it can be almost depressing. You look at these things and you go, God, everyone else seems to be doing all this stuff and I'm not doing anything. And then you go, well, actually...
Comparison. They're putting out their highlight reels and everything. And like people might... Yeah.
You don't see they don't put up the stuff where like, I'm having a bad day at work. And, you know,
so, to be honest, some people do. Positive. Yeah, I see some people doing that.
I never see that on mine.
And it makes them more relatable, I think, when they say, oh, well, actually, you know, this is the reality, or this is Instagram versus reality, you know, and show like, here's the Instagram picture and here's what it took to get that Instagram picture, or here's the background of that Instagram picture, or something like that.
I love that. Now, I've got another question for you, just in case you were relaxing too much.
Oh, no.
So you've done now over 100 episodes.
This is episode 101. Yeah.
Episode 101. Wow. So I've listened to your show. I love the show and I've lots of takeaways from the show. But what's your number one takeaway from all the guests you've had? Like what was one that really stood out, or one guest, or you can answer it whatever way you want. What have you taken as a number one?
I think there's a few different ways to answer that. And I'll answer it from a podcaster perspective, first of all. And I think that's the perspective that I've asked people to be on the show who I never thought would say yes. I was like, I'm chancing my arm here. There's no way this person is going to say yes to my little old podcast over here in Ireland. And I asked the question and I got a positive response. So I suppose like the lesson from that is just ask. Like if you can think of it, or if you have someone in mind, just go for it and just actually ask. to the point that what happened recently, or like in the last year, I think it was, that I was approached by the PR person for Edgar Schein, and you might recognize that name.
Yes.
So Edgar and his son Peter were guests on my podcast, but that wasn't me reaching out to them, because in my wildest dreams I would never have thought of asking them, because I just thought that's so far beyond. But they actually approached me, and I was absolutely honoured and so flattered. So that's kind of from that perspective. I think the more general perspective of what comes through, and this, if people have listened to episode 100, the highlights episode, the question I ask everyone is, what makes you happier at work? And really what comes through is the impact that people have on other people. So that's kind of, the general consensus of what makes people happy is how they are having an impact on someone else and how they can help other people. It's not about themselves. It's about the impact that they're having on the world. So that's the kind of second. And I suppose one thing that springs to mind in relation to, it was quite an early episode, and it was about happiness at work. And this is, I don't know, was this the first time it came up? It might have been the first time it came up in relation to work. And that's the idea of gratitude and being grateful and thinking about and sorry, I'll mention the name as well. It's Amelia Simon Thomas, and she talks about this, the approach to, she works for the Greater Good Science Institute, I think it's called, in Berkeley in California. And just this idea of being grateful. So like, I suppose you can think of it in a few different ways. Is it like I had a bit of a crappy day, so what are the good things to come out from that day, or what are the lessons that I can take from it? Or saying thank you. So like the power in a manager saying, thank you, I know you've been working hard, or thank you, I know you're just doing your job, but you're doing a good job. Just the power of gratitude, I think, is something that really stands out.
I love that. And I would say a lot of people are grateful to you for
thank you.
Your podcast.
Thank you. It's so funny, Carl, because, and you'll know this yourself, sometimes it feels like you're speaking into the void. Oftentimes I'm recording, I'm on my own, I'm, in a bedroom, I'm connected with someone on Zoom, most likely, which is great. But it can feel like you're just speaking into the abyss. And, I posted recently about hitting 40,000 listens, which I'm absolutely delighted with. And I do, of course, I'm like any other person. I call into question, like, am I having an impact? Am I doing the right thing? Am I saying the right thing? And really, it's, people responded and said, just keep going. And that's enough for me. That's enough to say, keep doing what you're doing. It's, I'm like,
I think you do such a great job with it, because as well, you summarize, which some podcasts I find, there's a chat or whatever happening, but I like that you summarize at the end. I like to do that on mine, and I appreciate that in yours, because I go, okay, well, at least I've got some takeaways. I can do something tomorrow with this, which is why I like your podcast so much. Because, and you do a great job then of sharing the notes on LinkedIn and everywhere. It's really good. So you should be really proud of yourself.
Thank you. And interestingly, that kind of synopsis, that summarizing, is a strength I never knew that I had. So it's probably something, I don't know, is it something I developed over time? But it's like being able to synthesize information. So being able to take a huge amount of information and pull out the key points and make it into a story or make it into something relevant. That's something that I didn't know was a strength, or I didn't know that other people couldn't do that, or I didn't know that I was particularly good at that. So thank you for calling that out.
That was the reason that I stayed listening to your podcast, to be honest. Like, I've been listening for a long time, and we only connected relatively recently. First of all, the topic really interests me, happier at work. My podcast is Better at Work. I'm I love the whole, how do we make work better tomorrow than yesterday? How do we make the staff more engaged, etc. So when I saw your podcast, Happier at Work, I'm like, I like the sound of this. And once I discovered it, I was like, God, she's doing, and I have to say, I was like, oh, this is really good in Ireland. It was great that it was, when I saw that you were Irish,
like an Irish person doing this,
I was even happier then. And you do a great job of synthesizing and all of that. I love it. I'm going to ask you another question in relation to the podcast. Is there anything you'd have done differently?
Yeah, I think when I touched on it at the start that I felt like I didn't really have a purpose. I like when I started, I put out a trailer, and I think about a month later, then I started putting out episodes. I give shout out to Furkan, who was my first podcast guest, and I think I was even a bit embarrassed to say that you're my first podcast guest. So I didn't want to kind of give the game away, like, oh, this is my very first time to do this. But she said afterwards, oh, am I your first podcast guest? And I was like, yeah. So she was my first guest, and I think if I had a bit more clarity, a bit like, I mean, it's evolved over time. I've been doing it for about 2.5 years at this stage, and I have all of these systems and processes in place to make things hugely efficient for my guests. So when they sign up, there's no back and forth emails. It's all done in a really systemized way. And I love that. But I think if I had a clearer vision of like, this is where I want to go with the podcast, this is what I want to say, it's evolved over time. Like I say, I knew I had a message I wanted to share. When my first few episodes, I reached out to people within my network. Now I get requests from people all over the world who want to be on the podcast, which is incredible. And again, there's a process for kind of applying all of that. But I think, yeah, it's kind of evolved now that there's 4 key pillars, and like people talk an awful lot about well-being at work. And I know we've touched on that in our discussion, Cathal, where I think like, not that well-being is the bad thing, but well-being is not the root cause of what's not right at work. I think you need to get other things right first before you kind of start talking about well-being. So I've moved away from this idea of well-being on the podcast. I want to focus more on the kind of the 4 pillars that I see as really, really important to culture and creating those better working environments before starting to think about well-being. I think well-being is kind of the thing that comes next.
Yeah, I love that because I think what you're thinking is you don't want to put the cart before the horse.
Yeah, exactly. You can't put almost, like it's like putting a plaster over a gaping wound. You need to fix the wound first with other stuff. You need to get the values piece right. You need to make sure people's needs are being satisfied at work, and then you can start thinking about, like, in my mind, and maybe I'm wrong, but in my mind, a lot of organizations do in relation to well-being is things like what we would have had is like someone coming in to do yoga with us, talking about nutrition, doing like dental hygiene, all of those kinds of things. But you know, and now since I've left the corporate life, you know, I've seen a lot more stuff around mental health, which is brilliant, which is great, and a lot more people talking more openly about that. But I think it's important to get the basics right first before you start looking at those.
I love that, because you're almost going, right, we need to get to the root cause.
The root cause, absolutely, and that's my entire career history, if you like, is you're trying to find that root cause.
Your data side, right? So it sounds like what has evolved is you've gone, actually, I've
gone back to my roots.
Yeah, you've gone back to your roots. That's a tagline for you now. You know, you've gone back to your roots, and I love that, because I do agree, right? You know, wellness programs and everything. If you've got a bad manager, I mean, wellness programs aren't going to make a blind bit of difference, because you're still going to have that Sunday night feeling of going, oh God, I've got to go in there tomorrow.
I feel sick.
She or he is a nightmare.
Yeah.
You know, that's a bigger issue than, oh, I'm going in tomorrow, but there's a yoga class at 10:30 at least. But if you've got a boss,
or like I don't have time to do these wellness programs. I don't have time, or I don't know who to reach out, or I don't know how to use them.
Yes, I totally agree. So thank you so much. That was really good to hear that one about. So I love that. You're basically saying you've sharpened your purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you've gone through over 100 episodes.
Yeah.
And you know what? How exciting for the next 100 episodes. It sounds like it's going to be
well, that's scary now when you start talking about that.
And you're going to be going back to your roots. Maybe that's what you should do as the ad for the next 100. Back to our roots, purpose driven.
Yeah. This is it. This is it.
Now I had one other question for you. Which is where to next for you, Aoife? What's next for you?
Yeah, interesting. I think I've sort of touched on that with the question around the kind of the evolution of the business. And for me, it is like I'm part of a couple of entrepreneurship programs at the moment, which are really propelling me in this direction. And I do want to ultimately get to a tech solution for finding a match between a person and an organization. Now, that sounds very broad. I have all of obviously the details kind of behind that, and it's all based on research, and I have so many ideas for like the different bolt-ons that can help, and I suppose maybe it's touching on it from a, well, what does this mean for a person or an organization? From a person's perspective, it's, for me, I see it as a tool to manage your career. And I think a lot of people either A, don't take responsibility for managing their careers, they're in a position and they think, I see that the next thing is this, and they're thinking only within their organization or within the role they have. So a way to kind of manage your career more effectively and think about the broader picture and work into your strengths and what are your values, and how do you get your needs satisfied, and how can you become happier at work? So managing your career a little bit more strategically. What skills do I need to take? What skills do I have? What are my skills actually worth in the marketplace at the moment? Are they quite rare, or you know, are they quite common? So, you know, then from an organization's perspective, and we touched on this earlier, the idea of being able to hire the right people, essentially. So,
yes.
You know, and hiring the right people. People always say we want the best talent and we want the best, and it's like, it's not, it's the best for your company is what you want. Because if you hire someone who is the best and you have like two superstars and actually there's a real clash of personality or values or something, it can cause a huge amount of conflict, which will result in lower productivity, resignations, all of this kind of stuff. So from an organization's perspective, it's about making sure, that you have the right people. And I suppose the path, sorry, go on. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say, it couldn't be a better time to be doing something like this, because you know, I think individuals, COVID has made people really reassess where their life's at. They're looking for more purpose-driven organizations to work at. And I love what you're talking about, values piece, because everyone I talk to, well, particularly here in Sydney, they go, my values aren't aligned with that company. Like, I
think people are becoming more aware of what their values are.
Yes. They're becoming way more aware. And it is hard sometimes, because I feel sorry for companies sometimes, because, and this, maybe the way I'm saying this isn't correct, but sometimes they have a good set of values, but they might have the wrong people executing those values.
So I'll touch on that, on the values piece. It's one thing to say what your values are. It's another thing that you live those values, and that's the lived experience of the people in the organization and the behavior that they're witnessing. So if you're saying something like, and I'll take inclusion as a value. If you're saying, oh, we value inclusion, but then you're doing something, you're behaving in such a way that creates an us and them environment, or you exclude some people in some way, or that you have an entire board made up of a particular type of demographic, and I'll say middle-aged white men, because that tends to be, you know, the kind of the normality, the reality for a lot of people. So it's about living the values, not just saying what they are. It's about the lived experience of the people. And what I do is assess what the values are versus what the lived experience of the people there is. So it's not just about saying what your values are. It's about assessing what your values are, and then assessing what the values of the people that you want to bring into the organization are, and seeing if it's a good
imagine
match.
If you, I mean, I was talking about this the other day with a friend of mine, like, you know, P&O cruises, you know, where they got rid of all those people. I'd love to see what their values are. What have they laminated? I bet there's something about treat our people fairly. So they're certainly not living their values, right?
No.
So I think, you know, look, I'm so excited for the future, because I'm excited to hear how you'll, you know, continue on your amazing journey.
Thank you.
I hope you get, you know, the way you said you get emails, or you email guests. I'm excited for someone to email you and say, hey, we're ready to build this with you, the technology component. So imagine if that happens.
That's why I decided to. That's why I decided to kind of talk about it for the first time. I never ever talk about this on my podcast. And it's, you know, I have all of the information. I'm in the process of recruiting people for pilots to, you know, by recruiting, I mean, like, just putting it out there to say, like, this is what I want to do. You know, I don't believe that exists in the context that I'm talking about it. I don't believe it exists at the moment.
I've never heard of it, and I've seen a lot of stuff come through that
Yeah.
people, are bringing into organizations. So I'm very excited. And when Aoife and I chatted about it a few weeks ago, I was like, oh, wow, I can't wait to hear who you pilot with or who gets involved, and I think it's great for the listeners, Aoife, to hear this side of you, because I certainly didn't know this side of you until we chatted more for a few hours on things. And also, I think for your listeners to know that you're going through you've had your squiggly career, you had your
it's still a bit squiggly now, Carl, I'm not going to lie.
And that's what I was going to say, like it's still squiggly, because it's like I love the whole, test.
I'm not preaching from a destination like, oh, I finally got here and I'm totally happy at work. It's like, it's an ongoing journey. And I think that's the beauty of a lot of life, is that it's about the journey. It's not about the destination.
I totally agree. And I'm so excited. I can't wait to hear what happens with that piece next. But I want to say, Aoife, thank you so much for taking the time and to have had the questions turned on you for a change.
Thank you for being such a great host and for asking some thought-provoking questions, and just for being you, Carl.
Oh, well, no, I really appreciate coming on, and I just can't wait for the next 100 episodes. I'm super excited. And thank you so much. And to everyone in Ireland, as I said, it's lashing rain here in Sydney, so don't feel jealous. We are not happier at work here today. It's lashing down with rain. But thank you so much, Aoife. All the best, and
thank you.
Can't wait to see what comes next.